Hello and welcome to episode 37 of the War Report. Now, do we have quite the episode tonight? This story just came out of nowhere. The whole Syria thing. This is not what I was expecting to do this week. I was expecting to talk about just some more yellow vests and Brazil stuff, but then all of a sudden Trump comes out and says, "Oh, hey, we're leaving Syria." At first, I think it's kind of the wishy-washy thing he did the last two times before the atrocities Assad allegedly committed. But then all of a sudden, you see the Russians saying, "Oh yeah, good job for getting out." You see the people protesting. You see actual, I guess you could call them victory speeches being made by Trump. You see the neocons freaking out to the point where, "Oh yeah, this actually looks like some form of withdrawal." I doubt it's going to be entirely, but it's looking like something. Yeah,
Yeah,
it came out of nowhere for me. But go.
Putin at the press conference literally said, "I want to believe." He's literally our guy now. No, I'm joking. Um, I think I think Mattis leaving is actually a big deal. I was initially wrong about it earlier this evening, but Mattis storming out is pretty significant. It's also significant to remember that General Flynn voted against going into Syria. And I think, trying to get him in the whole Russia Gate nonsense and him letting his guard down was really payback. Um, they'll want to blame him, but the truth is the American public is just doesn't want to stomach another Middle Eastern war.
Oh, absolutely not. But yeah, it's interesting. This is in the wake of the entire Flynn thing. But I just want to go over a timeline just for the sake of it because it actually looks like we're getting out of Syria. I just want to go over a timeline for those in the audience of American involvement in Syria. So I may be on a few minute tangent here, so just bear with me. So, of course, the war starts in between March and July of 2011 with the quote unquote rebel factions going up against Assad, all that fun stuff right there. And then the Saudis and the Turks begin funding their respective rebel groups getting involved. That triggers an Iranian involvement. And then, of course, that leads to the very tense first few years of the war between 2011 and 2013. You'll remember the media was talking about it. That's actually when you got the first real influx of refugees, mostly to Turkey. Because I remember seeing that, despite the fact that I barely paid attention to the news back since I was about 13 at the time, but that's all side points. Yeah, I was keeping up with it back then. I should have started the show much sooner, but again, you saw that
Little
basically.
Constantine.
Oh yeah, yes. Yeah, I still. Well, that's a story for a different day. But pretty much after the Saudi and Turkish programs began in Syria, the Iranians sent directly their special forces. They sent military advisors. They started training militias there. So it really started to escalate then. And then, of course, the first real chemical attack, the first real outrage about this was the I can't remember where it was, but it was the one in 2013 that Obama actually tried to get the Congress to approve a military intervention, which means Obama was on board for full regime change, full out war. He didn't just do the strikes that Trump did. He actually tried to go through Congress to get an AUMF so he could actually invade Syria. So if you think about that, a lot of people will tell you, like, oh, at least Obama didn't bomb Syria. A lot of the black pillars will go down that road. Well, that's because Obama wanted outright regime change, and Congress, in a rare moment of sanity, shot that down. And then you'll notice after the U.S. really tried to agitate conflict there, that's when the Russians really started getting involved, at least diplomatically. They didn't really send their forces until about 2015 after the rise of ISIS, which came, of course, after the big first chemical attack, the one that we can actually confirm was done by the rebels. So, yeah, that's when ISIS started to rise. It's when the CIA program officially started. I say officially. Keep that word in mind. And that's when the war in Syria really heated up with the real second wave of refugees, and that's when everyone was talking about refugees welcome. We need to take in these people. They're definitely not terrorists. We need to help all of these refugees. We need them in Paris and Berlin and London and Madrid and all these major Western cities. You must take in 1 million refugees each. But
Well,
yeah,
they're fighting the Arab Spring, right?
oh yeah,
They're not just refugees; they're Arab Spring rebels. I mean, the whole thing is actually, it's quite sad. It was just a dump of several millions gallons tons of gas into a fire. Um, yeah, and I've thought about, Russia when it joined, and because in 2014 I was thinking like Russia's really going to have to do something, and 2015 was really nearly over because it didn't join until like at the end of September or the first week of October. But then I think a lot of that had to do with what was happening in Ukraine, and I don't think I think it was they could not afford to get involved in a two-front conflict, and I think they needed to know that Crimea would be secured.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's
that
been quite
actually
a
makes a
ride.
lot of sense. Oh
Pardon
yeah,
me?
absolutely. And then yeah, that makes sense. That Crimea, of course, took priority over Tardis, which if we're being honest, that's what the entire point of the Russian war is. There, that's why they've tolerated so many strikes against Assad, because Tardis is secured, even as Israel doesn't touch it. But again, I'll get into that later. But then, come around 2016, you'll remember that was when the liberation of Aleppo was happening. That's when you first had these white helmets doing all these rescue missions, these very rescue missions that were just so perfectly caught on camera in the middle of a war zone. No staging at all, trust me. Completely 100% legitimate. If you question it, you're a fringe conspiracy theorist. You hate refugees, and you hate 8-year-old children with verified Twitter accounts telling you why we need to start World War III because Assad is mean.
Yeah, exactly. 2016 was also memorable for me because the Pentagon backed moderate beheaders started fighting with the CIA backed moderate beheaders. That was really quite special.
No, it was the Pentagon-backed communists fighting the CIA-backed beheaders.
Yes,
Get,
yeah, you
keep
are
your
right.
story straight here. Oh yeah, oh, the Kurds. I have so much to say about the Kurds, but just the point being, 2016, of course, Trump rolls into the White House, with his more non-interventionist thing. As you mentioned, Flynn was there originally, but he was very much ousted. His entire thing was very contrived. Like, oh, you want peace with the Russians? Oh, you want some de-escalation in the region? You want America to take a back seat when it comes to our military adventurism? We cannot tolerate that. You talked the Russian ambassador the wrong way, so you have to be put on a 2-year-long trial that is still ongoing as we speak.
Yeah,
But and then, of course, April 2017, the first serious strikes happened, which, apparently they weren't really that conspicuous. Trump just shot some missiles at some airfields, and nothing much happened. Then, of course, after that, the war just kind of lingered on. You mainly saw the war against ISIS shift towards Iraq with the Kurdish independence movement there, which that was a story in and of itself. But then, of course, you get to the Syria strikes earlier this year. You get to back in September when you think there's going to be another serious strike, but unfortunately, the Idlib offensive didn't happen, which I do want to talk about that a little in light of the U.S. troops. I mean, they are leaving right now, so I think we are actually going to get something of a partial withdrawal. Now, I'm not expecting a full withdrawal. We'll still have probably a couple thousand contractors there. Maybe none of our guys officially there, but again, I'll get into that in a second. But yeah, you had that. You had basically Putin negotiate this really rickety deal with Erdogan to try to keep them out of Idlib and try to turn that into a de-escalation zone. And then you come until now with Trump announcing, "Oh, we're pulling out our troops out of Syria." After a couple months ago, he said we're keeping them there to counter the Iranian aggression. Now, the funny thing is about the Iranian aggression, you see these neocons, they say, "Oh, this is going to embolden Iran and Russia," and then you see someone saying, "Oh, this is going to embolden ISIS." Well, which is it? It can't be both. Now, I know I'm being foolish expecting any consistencies from these people, but I want a solid answer to this question. Is it going to embolden ISIS? Are they going to take back ground? Or is it going to embolden the groups that are fighting ISIS, such as the Iranians, the Russians, the Assad regime, so on and so forth?
yeah. I mean, the narrative has never made sense at all. Of course, everybody knows that the objective is to remove Assad, but the narrative for the public, of course, is that they have to fight ISIS. It's patently ridiculous, and nobody bought it either. So, um, I would also say that First of all, for a while now, the American public isn't interested in this war, and Obama had to back down as well. Um, but the most recent developments, what I find interesting is this kind of projection that's coming out of the neocons and the humanitarian bombers, and that is there's this projection, right? Like Trump met with Erdogan, and the next day this happened. You know, like as if this wasn't an ongoing conversation for quite a while, right? So the projection, however, is that when we don't get what we want, somebody is controlling Trump. However, when we stop Trump, when we stop Trump, we're in charge. So who's exactly supposed to be in charge of America?
Yeah. Is it Putin or is the neocons? I mean, these narratives go back and forth. It's not like Trump is an independent actor surrounded with many different influence pulling him in many directions. No, it's not like he's any other president in that regard. It has to be the Russians or it has to be the secret resistance embedded in the administration.
Right.
If you believe that New York Times anonymous op-ed, which I still think is John Bolton, but again, that's aside the point.
Yeah, Bolton and Pompeo might be getting drunk right now. I don't know.
Yeah. They may be going like how Hillary was on election night. And again, I just want to discuss the current state of things. So with Turkey, you see this, of course. Then they agreed to buy American air defense systems, specifically the Patriot missiles, after they buy the Russian S-400 missiles, which I'm not sure if that deal's still on, but Turkey, of course, is still trying to court the U.S. a few months after scorning them, in which they'll probably go back to scorning us again over some diplomatic squabble somewhere. But again, Turkey's doing that thing where they oscillate every few months, and they're oscillating more towards the Americans. But expect around spring 2019 they go back to the Russians, then do a strong pivot back. That's how they do it. They slowly drift away from the Americans to the Russians, then do the strong pivot back, then the slow drift away. That's at least the pattern I've noticed.
Yeah, I've noticed the same pattern. Also, Erdogan really milked the Khashoggi thing extremely well, drop by drop. And it whipped up the media into a frenzy as well. They made it a very big deal. I mean, they absolutely turned on Saudi Arabia to the point that, they're not going to support them in Yemen.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's an entire another subject. I mean, again, if that Yemen thing, yeah,
right. But I think it's interesting how the media felt like the media needs the cover of this is the civilization of law and order and reporters matter and the rule of law and so on. They need that narrative in the same way that the U.S. needed that narrative to, possibly invade Syria or continue to fund or increase funding for Syria under the pretext of destroying ISIS. So I find that development really interesting. Also, there's a kind of Trump is practicing a kind of woke capitalism, they're buying our Patriot missiles, and this is going to absolutely infuriate them. But I agree with you that Turkey will switch. Erdogan has managed to create such a huge amount of clout and power.
Oh no, for someone I absolutely detest, it's kind of like how you respect your enemies because, oh, damn, that's good. It's like you're a worthy adversary. That's kind of how I feel about Erdogan. But the thing is, I want to say, you're hearing, again, a lot of these people who are like, we must save the Kurds, we must defend the Kurds types, the leftists and the neocons. They're saying, oh, Erdogan's going to invade Kurdish Syria. Do you think Erdogan's really going to squander this relationship he's been building with Russia for the past 3 years just to get at the Kurds?
Yeah,
really?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's a political tool. Yes, they have to face Kurdish terrorism and so on. And I'm not a fan of him either. I mean, I don't like him. To me, he's not trustworthy at all. However, he's really managed to have this kind of seesaw diplomacy. Very much like the geographical location of Turkey itself, where he's balancing U.S. and European interests with Middle Eastern interests, such as Iran. And I wouldn't doubt the Khashoggi thing was his way of making sure that Saudi Arabia doesn't interfere with what's happening in Syria in terms of negotiations. So he's handled it really well. He's managed to put America in a position where he wants them to be, and Saudi Arabia in a position where he wants them to be. Yeah, so it's a very interesting development.
Oh no, I mean he's completely either manipulated or managed to strike a deal with pretty much everyone in the region to the point where, look, him and Israel, they have their spats, but behind closed doors, they're shaking hands and drinking martinis or whatever, elite drinks they have nowadays. I don't know. I don't keep up these things. He speaks with Rouhani regularly. He goes to those summits with Putin, Rouhani. Saudi Arabia, he's managed to beat into a corner with this Khashoggi thing, as you were saying, and he pretty much he's balances things. And Qatar is the one last stronghold he has yet to conquer. Which those developments will be interesting over the next few months with Qatar leaving OPEC and just their shift in general. But again, we'll be discussing that as it happens. But yeah,
I mean, because Qatar leaving OPEC might itself be merely the precursor to forming better relations with Turkey.
Oh, I mean, possibly. I mean, again, that could go any way. But just on the Kurdish subject, I have to address this. So, as we were discussing the timeline of the war, mainly under Obama's administration, we supported the more Islamist elements, such as the quote-unquote Free Syrian Army, these groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda, more of these religious fanatics types to fight the Assad regime, whereas Trump kind of had to broker a compromise, like, oh, we can't get out of Syria just yet, but I don't want full regime change. So he decided, I'm going to support the Syrian Democratic Forces, which, of course, is the just Kurdish militias. They tried to tell you that there's Syrian Christians and Arabs in it, but no, I think it's some ridiculous. I think it's like 95% Kurdish fighters. It was basically a rebranding from the PKK to make Turkey less pissed off about it. But again, at the end of the day, they're just the Kurdish militias. So you have the Kurdish groups, especially in Syria. I know more so in Iraq, they're different. I'm not the biggest fan of the Iraqi Kurds either, but again, subject for a different day. You have these groups that are literal communists. They have they talk about how great Stalin was. They call themselves Democratic Confederalists, whatever that means. But basically, it's libertarian socialism backed by the CIA, as somebody on Twitter pointed out. I can't remember who, but I know I retweeted it. So if you want to dig through my timeline, but yeah, it's basically CIA-backed communism. So if I'm to understand the narrative correctly, the U.S. troops must stay in Syria and stand side by side with jihadists and communists in order to protect Syrian Christians. That's the narrative that we're going with now, apparently. These people who have not cared about Syrian Christians actually have worked to their detriment since 2011. I mean, before, but especially since 2011. All of a sudden care about them now that we're leaving them in the hands of Assad, whose entire political thing is built on the support of religious minorities.
I know, it's really extraordinary. And it's 2 years now that Damascus and Aleppo have Christmas. The streets are decorated, the lights are on. It's obvious that a good proportion of the country, especially the most populated areas, are under Syrian control. But I don't know if you want to, but I do think it's interesting that Syria is never going to be the same again, and in a way, Syria has lost its sovereignty because of this.
Oh, in many ways it has, but in many ways it's established itself on the world stage. I mean, you think about it, especially with Assad, assuming when he dies. I mean, I know he's like 50 something, so that's probably a while off. Whether someone in his family or someone within his political inner circle takes power, it's going to be a very marked thing on the world stage. This government power, this group of people, the people who came before them, who they were affiliated with, from the same regime, from the same, to use an antiquated term, dynasty, they pretty much defeated every major power trying to overthrow them with only moderate Russian and Iranian support. So they pretty much slayed several beasts as compared to someone like a Saddam or a Gaddafi, who fell within months of military action.
Yeah. It's Assad is not going to be part of this constitution. there's several there's several countries involved in the writing of Syria's constitution. Um, I mean, it's a broken state. It's going to be broken no matter how well put together it is afterwards. I do think that's sad that it's a country now that will be partitioned, and I mean it had its struggles that were innate, but it could have been solved. It could have been over much sooner, and it might not have come to this. So yeah, it's you know they're not going to have a hand in their own constitution, I don't think. So
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, the closest thing you're going to have is the Russians, who, of course, at the end of the day, have their own interests. Again, so long as they keep TARDIS, they'll pretty much keep anyone in power there that won't threaten their access to the Mediterranean. And, at this point, Assad is their best bet. So they're going to have that close thing. But even like Putin himself said, oh, yeah, we're willing to make some concessions to the Kurds, blah, 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 all the usual stuff. But, of course, Israel, they're going to weasel their way into having a hand in this. Saudi Arabia, maybe not so much now, but Turkey, the Iranians, again, they'll probably stick up for Assad somewhat. But again, it's going to be it's just complete restructuring by outside power. So in many ways, Syria has won. It could have been a lot worse for them, but it's still going to be devastating. But again, at the end of the day, they'll still have that legacy of, look, this Assad guy, he may be gone, he may be long gone, he may be in exile, he may be in a cell, he may have been executed, or whatever his fate happens to be. But there will be that legacy of Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, who resisted, by the time it's all said and done, probably a decade of regime change attempts, and finally had a peaceful ending and went off in exile or whatever.
I think I think that's a really great point. He will be remembered. He will be remembered as a pivotal figure in the last 25 years and the way it's going to forecast into the future. And there's in a way he'll be the antidote to this kind of strange sort of hollow pride that's happened ever since we began bombing the Middle East, even as far back as the 90s with the first Bush and then Clinton. And that is, when you read the headlines, you're almost, and it is a trap, right? I mean, there are fairly decent Americans who, buy into the idea that leaving Syria is handing over a victory to Russia, and we can sort of forget all the quote unquote blunders and mistakes. So it has become a kind of source of a hollow pride, and in a way, Assad coming out victorious, not quite in the sense that we might have been familiar with in the past, is kind of like it's a shock to the system. There are people, there are various I don't want to call them MAGA peds, but like a certain kind of Trump supporter that is looking at this. They're absolutely genuine and sincere about the Kurds. They don't trust CNN, but maybe they trust Fox, and they might be looking at this as this could be bad for Israel. But all of this kind of like hollow pride that the West has had to invest itself into, like nobody really supports the wars, but when it looks like that we have to leave, I think there is a kind of a tangible loss. I do think that like on some level there is something both jovial and kind of depressing about that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've poured how much into how many billions of dollars, how many years? I mean, trillions of dollars at this point. You look at the cost of Iraq, but again, I think you have a point, and I can only think of what the historians, I don't know, let's say a century down the road, 100, 150 years down the road, look back at this time, this beginning of the 21st century, end of the 20th century, that time period, the neoliberal golden age, as we termed it a few months ago, and they'll look at our foreign policy, they'll look especially at the Syrian war and think, they'll be baffled by just every aspect of it. A war that was completely created, manufactured from the outside, managed to last so long when, his contemporaries such as Gaddafi and Saddam and Ben Ali and Tunisia and all of these other figures who either fell, were executed, imprisoned, are in exile during the Arab Spring, and then you'll have this one who stood, but then was kind of swept away afterward. Which, like, as if your prediction pans out, that's what it's going to be. And it's like, yeah, I'm glad that Assad has stayed in power for so long, just for the sake of stability in the region. But you look in the history books, it was swift for someone like Gaddafi. It was a few months of war, and he was brutally executed. But when they look back, it's going to be Assad. He's like, you won this war, but you still lost your country.
Yeah, very much so, right? He won back a fractured state. I mean, the victory is, in a sense, is an abstract one. One of the other reasons I think that a lot of, not just elites, but let's focus on them, in America are upset is because it is genuinely like a sense of impotency. I think very much in a similar way when Obama said that, Assad had crossed the red line and he was going to go in, and then literally nobody talked about it. It just never happened. I think this, in many ways, is like that and more. So I agree with you. Assad staying around this long, he loses a country, but in a way, he demoralizes like the corrupt elements of an entire civilization.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, pretty much just the war in Syria, just the aspect of the being involved yet not being involved, has took a toll on the American people to the point where a lot of them didn't even know we were involved, and the ones who knew we were involved were like, why are we here? Even some of the more hawkish elements. But I do have to say, probably the biggest shame of this about the withdrawal is we will never see a rainbow flag fly over Rojava.
That's right. You saw the comment. I love it. This is a betrayal of gay rights in the Middle East.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh,
we will never
God.
see a gay wedding in Kurdistan. And that is probably the biggest injustice of all of this.
My favorite were those libs that went to fight with the Kurds in Afrin. It's just so tragic, Oh my God, I love how the Kurds created a horseshoe theory that literally brought together army veterans, MAGA Trump supporting guys, and British middle class communists just out of university going to help the Kurds. Kurds are a horseshoe theory, folks. So yeah,
Oh,
I found
absolutely.
that hilarious. Just
the
as a
real
side
rational centrists are the ones who realize they're dirty communists, but that is all aside the point. But let's get into the other big story for the day, the other big two stories. Afghanistan, reports are now coming out that we are decreasing American troop presence there by 7,000. This comes after weeks, not weeks, but months of negotiations with the Taliban. Now, as we were discussing last week, we've had a pretty good streak of negotiations that have been going on for a few months now, to the point where, and we were actually talking about this last week, there may be some at least partial withdrawal from Afghanistan on the table, considering the fact how good these negotiations have gone. Pretty much we decided it's not worth it anymore. Here, Taliban, just take this country because there's not much we can do with it. Now, between these two pieces of news, Secretary of Defense Mattis has resigned. Now, Mattis in the past, I liked him, but I will preface this on this. After beginning of 2018, especially after the Syria strikes, I pretty much accepted that the U.S. is going to be in these places until we can absolutely not afford it, whether through political capital or actual finances. And I figured Mattis is the lesser of all evils here, considering the fact he doesn't like the all-out wars, but he likes the slow burning wars with a couple thousand troops here, a couple thousand troops there that are kind of in war and kind of not. Let's not really escalate anything, but we're just going to keep little presences across the world. So I support Mattis from that perspective, to the point where it's like, this is probably going to do the least damage. But after this news about actual substantial withdrawals and plans to actually get out of places, I'm not too torn up about Mattis resigning.
Oh no, I'm not in the least. Yeah. In fact, I'm very glad he's gone. Um,
Well, like I said,
ultimately,
he looked sane because he was put next to John Bolton. That's pretty much
yeah.
what I'm gonna say.
Exactly. He looks because he was. That's very good. Uh, yeah, he's. I agree with you that his approach was slow burn, but ultimately it was a variation on a theme, and I mean, what did Trump really have to work with after Flynn? Uh,
Oh yeah, I mean H.R. McMaster, some Iraq war general that they pretty much just dug up and threw there. And then he decided, I'm going to one up you. I'm going to get John Bolton, but I'm also going to defang him to the point where I'm going to send him to Moscow and actually have him talk to Putin. Again, John Bolton, I've had my criticisms of him, but under Trump, definitely, that's not the John Bolton that worked under Bush. I'm not happy with the guy. I still cannot stand him. I still detest him in many ways. I probably touch on this every show, if not every day. But
yeah.
yeah, under Trump, he's been pretty moderated and defanged. But the thing about Mattis is, you listen to Trump's, especially like back in the campaigns, like, look, we're going to get someone tough in there. We're going to get someone there who's going to defeat ISIS. Of course, I'm not crediting the defeat of ISIS to the U.S. The most Trump did was like, let's stop supporting the people who run off and join them, but let's just support the communists who fight them, but just kind of suck at it. I mean, that was the majority of the U.S. battle against ISIS, but that's all aside the point. But again, it helped to the point where the forces that were actually fighting them could do it. And it's not surprising, he got the, mad dog, the tough guy to fight ISIS. And then he said, okay, yeah, time to go our separate ways. But the one thing about Mattis, I think Trump probably didn't like, and I've noticed, but I've never outright said, Mattis wanted to pretend like he was also the Secretary of State. He was being sent to China to negotiate things. He was being sent to like all these other places to like hold negotiations. And I would say in many ways he overstepped his bounds as to where he should be designing military policy, talking about defense. He wants to conduct diplomacy too. So I would say that was probably also a major point of contention, considering the fact we look at some of his stances. I doubt his diplomacy really lined up with at least Trump on a personal level.
Yeah, I would agree. The impression was, I think in many ways, Mattis, from a personality perspective, was there also to seem like a seamless switch. Here's an old hard-boiled egg, just like Flynn, and not to worry. We're in good hands. He knows what he's doing, and it was that sort of impression. A good, tough guy. And I think that was probably like Trump's choices are pretty limited, and that was probably an intelligent choice in a representative democracy. Unfortunately, that's how you choose a lot of people for certain positions.
Yeah, I have a feeling he was also kind of like along the lines of a Pompeo or a Bolton, where he's the junkyard dog on a chain. They're the look
Yeah.
mean, but like sort of like if we have a problem, you can deal with him, but you can deal with me if we don't. Kind of the good cop, bad cop thing. But I know this is a bit, kind of on it. I really should have named this episode "Flynn's Revenge" because if you look at it, he's being proven right on so many things, like a lot of what he believed in, and the fact that he's been completely just dragged through the courts and dragged through all of this of thinking hawkish. I mean, by no means perfectly hawkish on the Iranian issue, but a lot of people around, he looked pretty. But again, a lot of really vindicating Michael Flynn's positions.
Yes.
I mean, but
And Flynn, I mean, there's
I
so
mean,
much
just
in,
in general, I am a bit amazed now.
yeah, I would agree. Flynn,
So
Flynn looked at,
you might want to repeat
hello?
that.
Can you hear me?
Hello? Yes. Is he still there? Hey, chat. If you can hear GSP, if you can hear my co-host there, drop a one.
Can you guys hear me?
I was saying, I think it was pretty much Flynn's revenge, and
what do you want to do? You want to try to one. So can you hear me, Simon? You can hear me, right?
Hear me?
I do.
Oh, there we go.
Okay. So they can kind of hear you as well.
I'll be right back. Yeah, you just tell them what you're going to tell them, and I'll join back in a second.
Okay, so Constantine will be right back. He just has to get off and get back on to the line. So, so basically, what I was saying was, it might even be that Flynn, for the so-called Russiagate, might not even serve the full sentence. We don't know. I mean, that's still up in the air, but it looks like that Flynn will be vindicated, and that I think bodes very well, especially for the platform that Trump ran on. That was what I wanted to say in response to what Constantine was saying. If you guys have any questions, let me know. Field me some questions as we wait for Constantine to come back. Well, it's not easy doing a show on your own. Oh, I think he's back. There we go.
I've returned.
Okay.
Every time, and I'm one of these days I will fix this issue. I will find out what is wrong. I will root out this problem. But as you were telling them about Flynn, so I just
will
thought
be vindicated in the long run.
Yeah. And you know what I think would be hilarious? I mean, because Flynn was a national security advisor when this all went down, when he was pretty much dragged through the mud. I hope Flynn gets sentenced. I hope Trump pardons him, and I hope he makes him Secretary of Defense to replace Mattis. Now, I know there's a 99% chance that won't happen, but that will not stop me from dreaming.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what a crazy thing that is. That's an entire stream in and of itself. But yeah, just the Afghanistan thing. We've been talking about on the show for the past few months about, we're in negotiations, but I didn't expect this rapid withdrawal. Now, do you think that was probably some condition of the negotiations, that there had to be a drastic U.S. withdrawal for them to negotiate anything, or at least like some kind of like partial withdrawal or some kind of concession from the American side?
Yeah, I mean, let me put it this way. There's a lot to unpack here. I don't think this withdrawal is simply about, stopping the deal with the Russians for the S-400s and.
I'm talking about the Afghanistan withdrawal.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I think the writing was also on the wall for Afghanistan, because it's obvious that it's not working. The Afghan government is willing to work with the Taliban, and this is turning into a situation, in some ways, not unlike Israel and the Palestinians, but it's probably more amicable between the Afghan government and the Taliban. Considering
the fact that they're not two complete disparate cultures fighting over a very small piece of land. They're two very similar cultures fighting over a vast swath of land.
But yeah, I think there is a deal. This is happening very, very rapidly. This is why I'm a bit black pill too. I am not sure what's going to happen. Um, I don't think it's a ruse, but I don't completely trust it. Now, is the U.S. going to, put troops elsewhere? You were mentioning when we were talking earlier that you think they're going to probably be stationed in Asia.
Yeah, I think this is part of the pivot towards Asia. We've seen it diplomatically. Someone under Obama, especially under Trump, like I said, and like we were saying a few months back, like during summer, the neocons have been forced to admit that even the people who have been friendly with China have been forced to admit they've backed us into so much of a corner where they have to admit, oh yeah, China is a threat. We take money from them under the table, hand over fist. We take billions from them probably at this point. But yeah, we've walked ourselves in so much of a corner that we actually have to confront the Chinese, and we actually have to, talk to them in the Asia Pacific. We actually have to make partnerships with countries like Japan, the Philippines. I mean, partnerships more so than we already have. Australia. We actually need to strengthen our security ties there because China has become such a menace, and we've driven the Russians right into their arms. So, I think it's like we probably will see more troops in Eastern Europe, as you've been saying, but I think it's to combat this sort of contrived Russian Chinese alliance to the point where it doesn't have to be a Russian Chinese alliance, but the just stupidity of the neocons or malice, depending on who you ask, has created it. Considering the fact, I mean, yeah, you have Henry Kissinger, Henry Kissinger of all people, saying, "Oh yeah, we should be courting the Russians against the Chinese," and that's actually where a lot of people speculate a lot of Trump's policies have came from. So, yeah. As I see it, there probably will be some towards Asia, but seeing as Trump all of a sudden has gained some degree of control over his foreign policy, or at least is reasserting it, I think it'll probably be more towards countries like Japan, the Philippines, maybe not Korea because the peace talks, at least between the two Koreas, have been going pretty well. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw increased U.S. military presence in Australia.
Yeah, I don't doubt that at all. Yeah, I mean, I hope you're right. I think that's a very good argument. Time will tell. So far, there hasn't been a fake gas attack. Uh,
I mean, they took
so
the white helmets out, so the likeliness that decreases every day. They might try something, maybe not hoax chemical attack, but they might try something that draws back in. Maybe in Afghanistan, it's easier to do something to draw us back in. Syria, they might do something to draw us back in, but again, that's aside the point. And
yeah, I mean, my only concern is just today, or was it yesterday? The defense minister of Ukraine said that they're going to make another run for the Kerch Strait in the Sea of Azov. This is the tributary of the Black Sea.
yeah,
It's going to be another provocation. Uh, Apparently, Britain and France they haven't said that they're leaving Syria either. So that's my concern. That Ukraine is apparently planning another provocation in order to bring in troops. It's hard to say, but I think that's also another word that just isn't fresh enough anymore.
yeah.
And
My prediction is for the Ukraine thing, if they even do try it, which I have my doubts about because just the administration in charge of that country is an absolute joke. If they do try it, they're going to bungle it so bad to the point where it won't even get international attention because they're probably going to botch it so bad. I mean, they will for a couple days, but again, like as you were saying, it's a war that they just can't get people to care about. But yeah, I do have a bit of a tinfoil hat take. Yeah,
yeah,
of course, Trump hasn't made himself a friend of the European Union or anything, but I imagine there's people around there that are. And with France burning down, with the recent events in Belgium, which we'll get into with their prime minister resigning, maybe they're trying to turn America into the EU army. Maybe they're trying to move our troops there so we can suppress their riots for them. Now, of course, I know it's a bit far fetched, but at any point, who knows?
maybe not in the next 2 years, but I wouldn't completely rule it out in 2020. Another year and a half. Well, not another year and a half, but probably a little longer than that. I mean, things are moving very, very rapidly right now. But yeah, no, I don't see that immediately. I mean,
Yeah,
that would be disastrous. Like, Americans are not going to put up with America becoming some kind of police force over Western Europe.
I was being more facetious about it,
Yeah,
but
okay.
again, who knows what they're going to pull out of this? I don't know.
Yeah,
Who are they
it
running
won't
in
be this administration,
2020?
that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, and funny enough, you look at the 2020 elections, that apparently they have 12 Democratic primary debates scheduled starting in summer of June 2012. And again, if these withdrawals, or at least drawdowns, actually pan out to some significant degree, that's going to defang a lot of Democratic arguments. Democrats who like to at least pretend to be the anti-war party. I mean, what are they going to say against a president who cut our size in Afghanistan in half and got forced out of Syria? At least, our official force is not the couple thousand contractors we still have there for reasons X, Y, and Z. I mean, what are they going to say against that? So, this may just be, I'll take what I can get for whatever reason, but this may have something to do with the 2020 election coming up, trying to really ingratiate the more non-interventionist, anti-war voters and his core base, trying to get them back on board, especially with the rough couple of weeks he's had since the election, the rough couple of months, I should say.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, yesterday I tweeted out that something like the neocons and the libs are all pissed off because Trump pulling out of Syria is only going to help him for the election in 2020. I think they're well aware of that. A lot of people are fed up. People feel like this couldn't have been simply about oil. The trillions of dollars that this has cost, and really like with nothing to show for it. People feeling impotent from the pullout is in a way ignores everything that preceded it. Because there's no hope of reversing this. Pulling out is the best option that we've got.
I mean, absolutely, and I would say this. Again, my final thoughts on the pullouts, because I want to get into some of the yellow vest stuff to finish off the show, but my final thoughts about the pullout are, I think we've pretty much just exhausted our political capital in the Middle East to the point where they realize they're not going to get their Iran war, at least for now, at least under Trump. They're not going to get their Syria war, at least under Trump. And it's not really worth it anymore. And so we should move to other theaters, which, again, under the best circumstances, is the Asia Pacific. Under the less than ideal circumstances, but I can still tolerate Eastern Europe. But yeah, I expect them to try to fight this new Russian-Chinese axis that they've been fear mongering about, that they've been trying to drum up again. More so, oh yeah, we've completely isolated the Russians, and now we're surprised that they're an ally of the Chinese. And oh yeah, it turns out China's actually been a threat this whole time, and we're waiting until now to address it because the cash supply is running a bit low.
Funny how everything changed when Trump imposed sanctions on China. In a way, I think that demarked that a break had happened, and now you see the media following suit. I mean, Canada of all places arresting one of the CEOs of Huawei is extraordinary. Of course, now there's 3 Canadians who are detained in China, but beginning this year, that's not something we would have expected, because the emphasis was always on Russia, with nothing being said about China. I mean, China literally liquidating CIA assets, over a dozen of them. And that it got no play at all.
Yeah, and then the whole Russia thing. I think it's funny that as the year progressed, the hysteria about Russia died down, and then all of a sudden you get the Mueller investigation picking back up, and they pull out this Ukraine Kerch Strait crisis. Again, this seems like very desperate moves to try to drum up another Cold War with Russia. I mean, not that we're not already in another Cold War, but to basically put it on the radar of the American people, since most American people, that if they're really anti-Trump, they think, oh, Trump is Putin's puppet. If they're on the right wing, they're like, okay, yeah, we don't like the Russians, but they're not a threat. But again, you look at the opinion pollings, most people don't view the Russians as a threat. So they're pulling out all these like last stop things to try to get people on board with the anti-Russia hysteria, but it's just not working. So it's become just more laughable than anything. Now, of course, like I said, they're really pushing it, and I see, if not them drawing Russia into that trap, into that little protracted war they want in Ukraine to basically stab that thorn in their side and bleed them dry. I see the hysteria about Russia just dwindling down further and further. And again, as the world in general, and especially the United States, begins to focus on Asia, we'll hear less and less about the Russians.
Yeah, I agree. Unless something really monumental happens, and Putin's been able to let what would have been a monumental event 10 years ago slide, and and play the game. I think he's well aware of his weaknesses versus America's strength, and he's figuring things out diplomatically how to solve them, and he's just not taking the bait.
Yeah, and it's actually going to be interesting seeing the Ukrainian election next year because, Poroshenko, I think, is out regardless. Now, whether who replaces him is basically a carbon copy of him, who is another Western puppet, or whether maybe it's somebody a bit more reconciliatory towards the Russians, the jury's out on that. I think it may lean towards the latter, but do enough to appease the former. I think it'll probably be like some weird balance between the two and put Ukraine in again this weird Turkey middle ground, if you know what I'm saying.
I agree with you.
Unless over the next few months they can goad Russia into doing something really stupid in Ukraine and bleeding themselves dry, I don't think really anything's going to come of the Russia hysteria.
Yeah, I think a large part of the Russian hysteria is to delegitimize Trump. I think that's the main thrust of it.
Okay, so
they're going to be antagonistic towards Russia anyways. But Russia integrated into the West, say vis-a-vis NATO, EU, what have you. It would just be too. It would be asymmetrical. It would just be too powerful. And that's why they could never be integrated into it.
Oh no! It's funny because I was literally just came to my head. You think about Russia in the '90s; they're in that protracted conflict with Chechnya and the other more Caucasian republics, the larger Islamic populations. I think they're basically trying to. I know I've really hammered on this point, but I think they're basically trying to turn Ukraine into another Chechen war where they want to make the Russians look incompetent and have them lose something. But again, if Russia and Ukraine were to go to war, I think we know how that would end. I think it would pretty much backfire for the people trying to really draw this conflict out. But again, I think Putin is smart enough to avoid that. But to avoid droning on the topic, there is just something I want to finish off with. I want to return to our friends, the Yellow Vests, which have been spreading across Europe, of course, started in France. And the big major piece of news I saw is they were able to force a resignation from the Prime Minister of Belgium.
Incredible.
Yeah, and you think Belgium, Brussels, the seat of the European Union, the seat of NATO. The president, not president, prime minister of that country resigns. Wow, it's actually a bit amazing. I think he was some so-called right-wing leader, one of those really establishment conservative right-wing leaders who pretty much just delays the inevitable in their country by 2 to 3 years. But yeah, they forced him to resign. I don't know when the next election is going to be because it wasn't just some replacement. It said the Belgian government has fallen, in which European governments, the parliamentary terms. If a government has fallen, that means a new election has been forced.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to see what comes out of that.
Yeah, Brussels was a sleeper. I remember 2 weeks ago, they were storming. Well, no, storming is maybe an exaggeration, but they were right in the steps of their parliament. And, but of course, Paris took center stage. I guess in some ways we don't know the full extent of these protests, how large they are. But I did not expect, the prime minister or the president of Brussels to step down. That's a shock.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't even tell you who he was. I mean, he's again, when you get into countries that small, most people don't know the leader. I mean, most people barely know the president of France or who Angela Merkel is. But again, most people don't. I'm not saying that to begrudge them or insult them. I'm just saying they don't keep up with it. But if they're not going to know who they are, they're not going to know who the prime minister of Belgium is. Like I said, I do this show like almost every week, and I don't even know who the prime minister of Belgium, is/was. But it's interesting you mentioned Paris, and of course that's where this all started. Now there are the Blue Vest protests, which are the police who are joining in the protest. Now we saw before during the initial protests, a lot of police would abandon their stations, take off their riot gear, take off their helmets, and stand with the protesters. But now you're seeing them put on blue vests, mainly people involved with the police unions, and going out and joining the protesters. So, as we said, Macron, because the French establishment is pretty much solidified, Abe was able to escape his vote of no confidence, able to escape being removed from office. But again, he's turned his entire country against him to the point where even a lot of the police force won't put down the protest, or of course, the ones that turn the riots. And with less police escalation, I doubt you'll see as many riots because, of course, like when you're butting heads, when there's conflict there, it's bound to escalate. But when the cops are on your side, there's less room for escalation, which will make the protest more legitimate in the eyes of the people who are kind of undecided or didn't really pay attention to the situation. And again, I find this funny. France recommits their troops to Syria while their own country is burning down. It's like, if Macron is out, how much longer do you think those troops are going to stay in Syria? Because you look at the populist movements in Europe, that there's less that influence. There's less that big military-industrial complex kind of global homo influence, if you will. So, for example, if hypothetically, I know this is a bit out there, you have an election forced, you have Le Pen win it. I'm not sure if this is even possible in the French system. Do you think Le Pen will really keep French troops in Syria? I mean, I would lean towards doubting it, and I would lean towards doubting anyone who they would elect would keep French forces in Syria. I mean, considering the fact the yellow vest protesters, and I'm assuming by extension blue vest protesters, one of their main points was we need to get France out of the European Union and NATO. A lot of these anti-European Union types don't really touch NATO or are actually in favor of NATO, so it's kind of interesting to see this.
Yeah, it is. It's a major swing. I mean, it's over for Macron, and I think no matter who takes over afterwards, after the next election, but I have huge doubts that France is going to maintain a presence in Syria. I have enormous doubts about that. It's such an unpopular position now, especially with we'll see in the next few weeks with America announcing that they'll leave. It's also, it's major because about 2 weeks ago, Macron was using some of his elite units in order to ensure that the police were doing their job. But now there's been a walkout. I think firefighters have also walked out. I'm not sure. I don't think they've joined the protest per se as a distinct group. But the blue vests joining in, that's the biggest vote of no confidence there could ever be.
Yeah, I know we didn't touch on the migration pact this episode, but again, we were talking last episode that military officials in France were saying that signing this pact amounted to what they saw as treason. So we may see some insurrection within not only the protest but the military. Another thing to keep in mind about the military is Macron, in his infinite wisdom, decided to bring back mandatory service. So you think you're going to be drafting a bunch of young men, young men especially who've been at the face of these protests, and expect them not to use those, assault rifles that you just gave them against you. You're batshit insane. Pardon my language. I usually keep it a bit cleaner on the show, but again, you're insane. You think you're going to draft a bunch of these young men who hate your government, who hate you, and think they're not going to turn on you.
No. It's hard to believe because people in elite positions, they're highly intelligent, they're planning well ahead, but hubris really is something. People can really become arrogant and at the end fail, even with all the best made plans. France is, I think, going to be in political turmoil for quite some time. Who's ever elected afterwards? Um, I don't know if Macron is going to use that. I don't know what kind of political capital he has left. But it'll be interesting. Yeah, enormous developments.
Oh yeah, I mean absolutely. Now, if we want to get like more meta about this, we want to take a zoomed out view. I mean, look, you had the American Revolution, which of course created some liberalism, republicanism. It kind of brought that back to the world. But again, you look at where this started in Europe. It started with the French Revolution. I mean, and if you're to look at this, like the next French Revolution, if you will, like the populist and nationalist rising up. How much stock you put in that, I don't know. But you look at that, it's like, is the rest of Europe going to follow suit? And based on historical trends, I'm inclined to say yes.
Yeah, I am too. I am too. They bit off more than they could chew, so.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this goes around to like what I was talking about on Monday before any of these developments actually happened, because this is actually a show based on developments within the last couple of days. Kind of interesting for a podcast supposed to cover the entire week, but again, that's aside the point. That liberalism is not surviving the shifting world order. I went through that video. You guys can watch if you want. I listed several up and coming powers and how none of them they've either not embraced liberalism, if not outright rejected it. Same with secularism. But again, it's very. This has been an insane show. This has been an insane weekend. This is probably the last show of the year, which I would say this is a pretty good way to end the year off. So I guess we'll see you guys come 2019. Who knows what will happen then? I may do like another unrelated stream probably after Christmas if you guys want to tune into that. But this has been episode 37. Thank you all for tuning in to this absolutely wild episode. I'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.